March 28th, 1942, 1:34 a.m. The Loire Estuary, Nazi-occupied France. Commander Stephen Beatty gripped the bridge rail so hard his knuckles turned white. Dead ahead, through the darkness and rain, lay the most heavily defended port in Europe. German searchlights swept the black water. Gun batteries waited in silence. And his ship, a battered old destroyer disguised to look German, was sailing straight into the jaws of death with 4 tons of explosives hidden in her bow. "Steady as she goes," Beatty said, his voice barely above a whisper. The German searchlight found them. A blinding white beam locked onto the bridge. Every man aboard froze. This was it. In seconds, every gun in Saint-Nazaire would open fire and 600 British commandos would die in the cold waters of the Loire. But Beatty didn't flinch. Instead, he did something that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He kept sailing straight ahead. What happened over the next 37 minutes would become one of the most audacious military operations in history. The Admirals had called it suicide. The planners gave it a 50-50 chance at best. But what Commander Beatty and his men achieved that night didn't just change the war, it changed the very definition of what courage could accomplish. If this story moves you, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this incredible tale unfolds. So, how did a mild-mannered naval officer from Wales end up commanding a mission that his own superiors believed was certain death? The answer begins not in the cold waters of France, but in the frozen fjords of Norway, with a ship so terrifying that Winston Churchill couldn't sleep at night. Her name was Tirpitz, 42,000 tons of German engineering perfection. The most powerful battleship ever built in Europe. Her 8 15-inch guns could punch through armor from 20 miles away. Her belt of steel was thick enough to shrug off almost any weapon the Royal Navy possessed. And in January 1942, she sailed from Germany to Norway. Churchill called her the Beast. And the moment she arrived in Norwegian waters, the entire strategic balance of the Atlantic shifted. Every convoy to Russia now faced the possibility of sudden annihilation. Every Allied supply ship sailing north knew that somewhere in those frozen fjords, Tirpitz was waiting. But the British had a plan, not to sink her. That would require an entire fleet and would cost thousands of lives. No, their plan was far more cunning. They would make it impossible for Tirpitz to ever operate in the Atlantic at all. Here's what the Germans didn't want anyone to know. Tirpitz had a fatal weakness. She was so massive, so complex, that only one dry dock on the entire Atlantic coast could repair her if she was damaged. Just one facility in all of occupied Europe had the capacity to service a ship of her size. That dry dock was in Saint-Nazaire, France. The Normandy dock. Named after the famous French ocean liner, it measured over 1,100 feet long, one of the largest dry docks on Earth. If the British could destroy it, Tirpitz would never dare venture into the Atlantic. One hit from a torpedo, one mine, any damage at all, and she'd have nowhere to go for repairs. But destroying the Normandy dock seemed impossible. Saint-Nazaire sat 8 miles up the Loire estuary, protected by water so shallow that no British battleship could approach. The harbor bristled with over 80 heavy guns, countless machine gun positions, and thousands of German troops. The coastal defenses had been designed to repel an invasion fleet. And yet, in a cramped office in London, a small group of men began plotting the impossible. Captain John Hughes Hallett leaned over a table covered with maps and photographs. Around him sat some of the most unconventional military minds in Britain, men who had been asked to devise a way to destroy a target that couldn't be reached. "We can't bomb it," Hughes Hallett said flatly. "The dock gates are too strong. We'd need a direct hit with the largest bomb in our arsenal, and the Luftwaffe would shoot down our planes before they got within 10 miles. "What about submarines?" someone asked. "The estuary is too shallow, too heavily mined." A submarine couldn't get close enough. The room fell silent. Every conventional option had been exhausted. And then, a young naval officer named Commander Robert Ryder spoke up. "What if we didn't try to bomb it or torpedo it? What if we rammed it?" The others stared at him. "Think about it," Ryder continued. "We take an old destroyer, pack her with explosives, sail her right up the estuary, and drive her straight into the dock gates. By the time the Germans realize what's happened, the ship explodes and takes the entire dock with it." Hughes Hallett shook his head slowly, but he was smiling. "You're talking about a suicide mission. I'm talking about the only mission that has any chance of working, and that's how Operation Chariot was born. But what they didn't know yet was that the man they would choose to command this desperate attack was a 34-year-old officer from Cardiff who had never expected to become a hero. His name was Stephen Haldon Beatty, and he was about to face a choice that would define his entire life. Beatty wasn't a warrior by nature. He was thoughtful, methodical, the kind of officer who planned every detail and never raised his voice. His men respected him because he respected them. He led by example, not by intimidation. When Beatty was called to a meeting at Combined Operations Headquarters in February 1942, he had no idea what awaited him. He was told only that volunteers were needed for a dangerous mission. The details would come later. He walked into a room full of naval officers, all of them looking as confused as he felt. At the front stood Lord Louis Mountbatten himself, the chief of Combined Operations, a man whose reputation for bold, unconventional warfare had made him a legend. Beatty studied the faces around him. There were destroyers, captains, motor launch commanders, communications officers, Men from every branch of naval service. Whatever this mission was, it clearly required specialists from across the entire fleet. That alone told him it was something extraordinary. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and anxiety. Maps covered the walls, but they were turned face down, their secrets hidden until the proper moment. Outside, the February rain drummed against the windows, a constant reminder of the cold, gray world that awaited them beyond these walls. Mountbatten didn't waste time with pleasantries. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to do something that naval doctrine says cannot be done. I'm going to ask you to sail a ship into a fortified enemy harbor and ram it into a target while under fire from every direction. The ship will be packed with explosives. The chances of survival are uncertain. He paused, letting the words sink in. I need commanders who understand that this mission may be their last, but I also need men who believe it can succeed. Because belief, gentlemen, will be the only thing keeping you alive when every gun in France is pointed at your bridge. The room was silent. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances that said everything. This was madness. But Beatty didn't move. His mind was already racing through the logistics, the approach, the timing, the explosives. It was insane. It was also, he realized, the most important mission of the war. When Mountbatten asked for volunteers, Beatty was the first to raise his hand. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Germans had already received intelligence suggesting an attack on Saint-Nazaire was possible. The defenses were being strengthened every day. By the time Beatty's ship reached the harbor, it would face twice as many guns as the planners expected. The mission was already compromised before it even began. The ship chosen for the ramming was HMS Campbeltown, a worn-out destroyer that had seen better days. Originally built for the United States Navy as USS Buchanan, she had been transferred to Britain as part of the Lend-Lease agreement. At 23 years old, she was considered obsolete, perfect for a one-way mission. But she needed to be transformed. Her appearance had to be changed so completely that German lookouts would mistake her for one of their own. Workers cut down her distinctive four funnels to 2, angling them to match the profile of a German Meaux-class torpedo boat. Her superstructure was modified. German naval flags were prepared for the approach. Even her silhouette was altered using wooden frameworks covered in canvas. Every detail was scrutinized. German naval architecture had specific characteristics, certain angles, certain proportions, that trained lookouts would recognize instantly. The disguise had to be perfect, because even a moment's hesitation from the enemy gunners could mean the difference between success and annihilation. The shipyard workers labored around the clock. They knew only that this vessel was being prepared for a secret mission of critical importance. The secrecy was absolute. Even the workers' families were told nothing. Inside her bow, naval engineers created a steel and concrete coffin. 24. Mark 7th depth charges, each packed with Amitol explosive, were buried within this structure and sealed behind a thick steel plate. The fuses were set to detonate between 8 and 12 hours after arming. Long enough for the crew to escape, long enough for the Germans to assume the ship was harmless. 4¼ tons of high explosives, enough to vaporize the dock gates and flood the entire dry dock facility. Beatty watched the modifications with a mix of fascination and dread. He knew what it meant. His ship was being converted into a floating bomb, and he would be standing on the bridge when it sailed into enemy fire. She's a good old girl, his first officer said, patting the Campbelltown's hull. Seems a shame to sacrifice her. Beatty looked at the battered destroyer, rust streaking her sides, her paint faded and peeling. She's going to do more damage to the Germans in one night than she could in 10 years of conventional service. That's not a sacrifice. That's a legacy. But the Campbelltown was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The mission required more than just destroying the dock gates. It required chaos. It required the Germans to be so overwhelmed, so confused, that they couldn't mount an effective defense. That's where the Commandos came in. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman commanded 2L Commando, one of the elite British Special Forces units formed for exactly this kind of impossible mission. His men were trained in hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, and night fighting. They had volunteered for danger, knowing that their chances of survival were slim. Newman was a solicitor before the war, a man of law and order who had transformed himself into a warrior through sheer determination. His commandos respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He trained with them, ate with them, and made clear that when the bullets started flying, he would be right there beside them. The commando training had been brutal. Night exercises and freezing Scottish locks, 20-mile forced marches with full kit, demolition practice until they could plant charges in total darkness by touch alone. These men were among the most highly trained soldiers in the world, but even the best training couldn't fully prepare a man for what awaited them in Saint-Nazaire. Newman gathered his officers in a briefing room and laid out the plan. While Campbelltown rams the dock gates, our assault teams will land from motor launches at multiple points around the harbor. Our objectives are the pump house, the winding mechanisms, and the secondary dock installations. We destroy everything that makes this port useful to the German Navy, he pointed to the map. The biggest problem is extraction. The motor launches can only hold so many men, and they'll be under fire the entire time. Some of us will have to fight our way out of the town on foot. The plan is to link up with French resistance cells and escape overland to Spain. One of the young officers raised his hand. Sir, what are the odds of that actually working? Newman didn't blink. Low, very low. But that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because if we succeed, we shorten the war. We save ships. We save lives. Maybe not our lives, but lives all the same, the officer nodded slowly. There was nothing more to say. As the day of the mission approached, the men of Operation Chariot prepared themselves in their own ways. Some wrote letters to loved ones, letters that might never be sent. Others checked and rechecked their equipment. A few simply stared at the sea, lost in thoughts they never shared. One young sailor, barely 19, spent his last afternoon ashore sitting in a church. He wasn't particularly religious, but the quiet helped. The ancient stone walls had witnessed centuries of men going off to war. There was comfort in that continuity, in knowing that others had faced similar moments and found the strength to carry on. The married men wrestled with different demons. They thought of wives and children waiting at home, of promises made and futures uncertain. Some wrote letters that tried to explain why they had volunteered, why this mission mattered enough to risk everything. Most couldn't find the words. How do you tell someone you love that you've chosen to sail into certain danger? Beatty spent his final hours before departure walking the decks of Campbeltown, speaking quietly with his crew. He knew most of them wouldn't survive. The Navy had assembled the best sailors it could find, men who understood exactly what they were volunteering for. Any regrets? His first officer asked as they stood together on the bridge. Beatty considered the question carefully. Only if we fail. If we succeed, then everything we've sacrificed means something. If we fail, he shook his head. Let's not fail. On the afternoon of March 26, 1942, the raiding fleet assembled at Falmouth Harbor. It was an unlikely armada. 1 converted destroyer, 16 motor launches, 1 motor gunboat, and 1 motor torpedo boat, 611 men in total, sailors and commandos alike. As the ships prepared to depart, the crews gathered on deck for a final briefing. Lord Mountbatten himself had come to see them off. "You are about to undertake one of the most hazardous operations in the history of naval warfare," Mountbatten told them. "But you are also about to strike a blow that will echo through this war. The Germans believe Saint-Nazaire is invincible. Tonight, you will prove them wrong." He paused, his eyes moving across the assembled faces. Young and old, officers and enlisted men, all of them about to sail into the unknown. "Good luck, and Godspeed." At 2 p.m., the fleet slipped out of Falmouth Harbor and turned south toward France. The English Channel stretched before them, gray and cold under a clouded sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy waited. But what awaited them was worse than any of them could have imagined. As the raiding fleet sailed south, German intelligence officers in Berlin were piecing together a puzzle. Increased radio traffic from British combined operations, reconnaissance aircraft spotted over the French coast, unusual naval activity in southern England. Something was coming. They just didn't know what. At Kriegsmarine headquarters, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, received reports of a possible British operation. The target was unknown, but the timing suggested it would happen soon. Orders went out to coastal defenses along the French Atlantic coast. Heightened alert. All leave cancelled. Gun crews to remain at their stations. At Saint-Nazaire itself, Captain Lieutenant Ado Diekmann commanded the harbor defenses. A capable officer with years of experience, Diekmann had spent months fortifying the port against exactly the kind of attack the British were planning. He had positioned his guns to cover every approach, laid mines in the shallow waters, and trained his men to respond to any threat within seconds. When the alert came through, Diekmann smiled grimly. Let them come, he thought. They'll never get through. But there was one thing Diekmann didn't know, one thing that would change everything. The British had obtained the German recognition signals. In the intelligence war that ran parallel to the shooting war, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had achieved something extraordinary. They had cracked the German naval codes and extracted the current, challenge, and response signals used by German vessels. For a brief window of time, any ship displaying the right lights and transmitting the right codes would be assumed to be friendly. It was a slender thread to hang 600 lives on, but it was all they had. The first night passed without incident. The fleet sailed through waters patrolled by German submarines, past coastal lookout stations, through areas where Luftwaffe aircraft regularly searched for Allied shipping. Somehow, miraculously, they weren't spotted. On the morning of March 27th, the fleet rendezvoused with the submarines HMS Sturgeon and HMS Tyndale, which would guide them through the final approach. The submarine captains confirmed that the route was clear, the weather was holding, everything was going according to plan, almost too well. Among the commandos aboard the motor launches, a young sergeant named Thomas Durrant checked his weapon for the 100th time. He had volunteered for this mission because he believed in what they were doing, but he wasn't naive about his chances. "Nervous?" another commando asked. Durrant shook his head. "Not nervous, just ready. Whatever happens, I'm ready." He would prove those words in the most dramatic way imaginable, but that moment was still hours away. As darkness fell on March 27th, the fleet made its final turn toward the French coast. The plan called for them to enter the Loire estuary at 11:30 p.m., navigate the shallow channel in darkness, and reach Saint-Nazaire by 1:30 a.m. on March 28th. Beatty stood on the bridge of Campbeltown, watching the coastline emerge from the gloom. Ahead, he could see the faint glow of lights from the shore, evidence of German positions, of men who had no idea what was coming. Behind him, the motor launches spread out in formation, their engines throttled down to minimize noise. In each boat, commandos sat in silence, faces blackened, weapons ready. Some prayed, some thought of home. All of them knew that within hours, many of them would be dead. At 11 p.m., the fleet reached the mouth of the estuary. And then, disaster struck. "Contact bearing 180, a lookout shouted. "German vessel, sir." Beatty's blood ran cold. Through his binoculars, he could see the silhouette of a German patrol boat cutting across the water ahead of them. If the enemy spotted them now, the entire mission would be over before it began. "All engines stop," Beatty ordered, keeping his voice calm. "Maintain radio silence." The fleet drifted in the darkness, barely moving. Every man held his breath. The German patrol boat continued on its course, its spotlight sweeping the water. Once, twice, then passing on without stopping. It hadn't seen them. Not yet, but the encounter had cost them precious time. They were now behind schedule, and every minute of delay increased the chances of detection. "Full ahead," Beatty commanded. "We need to make up that time." Campbeltown surged forward, her engines straining. Behind her, the motor launches struggled to keep pace. The carefully planned formation began to stretch and distort as faster vessels pulled ahead of slower ones. And then, at 12:22 a.m., the German searchlights found them. It started with one beam, stabbing out from the shore like an accusing finger. Then another, then a dozen. Within seconds, the entire fleet was illuminated in harsh white light, exposed and vulnerable. This was the moment everything depended on. The German recognition signals, the disguise, the audacious bluff that might just save them all. Leading signalman. William Pike raised his Aldous lamp and began flashing the captured German codes. In international signal language and then in German Morse code, he transmitted 2 craft damaged by enemy action. Request permission to proceed to harbor. The searchlights held them in their glare. On the shore, German gunners awaited the order to fire. Thousands of men stood ready to unleash devastation on the British fleet. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds, an eternity under those blinding lights, nothing happened. Then, incredibly, one by one, the searchlights began to switch off. Pike's message had worked. The Germans, confused by the authentic codes and the familiar silhouette of what appeared to be a friendly torpedo boat, hesitated. It was exactly the hesitation the British needed, but it couldn't last forever. At 1:28 a.m., a German officer finally recognized the truth. The ship approaching their harbor wasn't German at all. It was British, and it was heading straight for the dock gates. "Alarm! Feindliches Schiff!" The cry went up across the harbor. "Fire! Enemy ships!" Every gun in Saint-Nazaire opened up at once. Beatty would later describe what happened next as sailing through a wall of fire. Tracer rounds streamed across the water from every direction. Shells exploded in the air, on the water against the hull of the Campbeltown. The noise was beyond description, a continuous roar of destruction that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The smell was something no one had prepared them for. Cordite and burning oil mixed with the salt spray. Men who had trained for months in simulation exercises discovered that nothing could replicate the visceral horror of actual combat. The concussion of nearby explosions rattled teeth and blurred vision. The heat from burning vessels turned the cold night air into something suffocating. Beatty watched as one of his sailors was cut down by machine gun fire not 5 feet away. There was no time to mourn, no time to process what he had seen. The dock gates were getting closer. That was all that mattered now. On the motor launches, men began to die. One vessel took a direct hit to her fuel tanks and exploded in a ball of flame, killing everyone aboard. Another was raked by machine gun fire, her crew cut down where they stood. A third capsized after her steering was destroyed, but the fleet kept coming. Beatty stood on the exposed bridge of Campbeltown, refusing to take cover even as bullets whined past his head. He needed to see. He needed to steer. Everything depended on hitting the dock gates at exactly the right angle. "Steady! Hold your course!" A shell struck the Campbeltown's funnel, tearing it apart in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Another hit the deck just aft of the bridge, killing 3 sailors instantly. Fire broke out near the ammunition lockers, and damage control teams rushed to contain it. Through it all, Beatty kept his eyes fixed on the target ahead, the massive gates of the Normandy dock, growing larger with every second. 400 yards? 300. 200. At 1:34 a.m., HMS Campbeltown struck the outer caisson of the Normandy dock at a speed of 19 knots. The impact was so violent that it threw men off their feet throughout the ship. The destroyer's bow crumpled like paper, driving deep into the steel and concrete of the dock gate. The ship rode up onto the structure, her forward section wedged firmly against the target she had been sent to destroy. Beatty was thrown against the bridge console, but he kept his feet. Around him, alarms blared and wounded men screamed, but he felt something else too, a fierce, savage joy. They had done it. They had actually done it. All hands abandoned ship. Commandos away. The demolition teams poured over the sides of the Campbeltown, their mission just beginning. Above them, the sky blazed with gunfire. The Germans had realized too late what was happening, and now they were trying desperately to destroy the commandos before they could complete their work. But the British weren't finished yet. Lieutenant Stuart Chant led his demolition team toward the pump house that controlled the dry dock. Their job was to destroy the machinery that pumped water in and out of the facility. Without it, the dock would be useless, even if the gates were eventually repaired. The team sprinted across the quayside under withering fire. German bullets kicked up sparks from the concrete around them. 2 men fell before they reached the pump house doors. "Cover me!" Chant shouted, pulling out a demolition charge. His men returned fire while Chant placed the explosives. His hands were steady despite the chaos around him, months of training taking over when conscious thought would have frozen him with fear. Fire in the hole! The charges detonated, ripping apart the pumping machinery in a cascade of flame and flying metal. One objective down. Across the harbor, other teams were achieving similar success. The winding gear that operated the dock gates was destroyed. Secondary installations were put to the torch. German equipment, carefully maintained and positioned for the day when Tirpitz might need repairs, was systematically demolished. But the price was terrible. Commandos fell to German fire with every passing minute. The motor launches that were supposed to extract them had been decimated. Only a handful remained operational, and they were struggling to approach the quayside through the storm of bullets and shells. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, leading the ground assault, realized the awful truth. Most of his men would never leave Saint-Nazaire alive. "We fight our way out," he told his surviving officers. "Through the town, into the countryside. Anyone who can walk, anyone who can fight, we go." For the next several hours, small groups of British commandos battled their way through the streets of Saint-Nazaire, engaging German troops in desperate firefights. Some were killed, some were captured. A handful made it to the edge of the town before dawn forced them to go to ground, but none of them escaped. Newman himself fought until his ammunition ran out, then continued fighting with his bare hands until he was finally overwhelmed and captured. His courage would earn him the Victoria Cross, one of 5 awarded for the raid. On the water, the destruction of the motor launches had created scenes of horror and heroism in equal measure. Sergeant Thomas Durrant was aboard motor launch 306 when she came under attack from the German destroyer Jaguar. Durrant manned a Lewis gun mounted on the deck, facing a warship 100 times his vessel's size. For over an hour, Durrant kept firing. When he was wounded in the arm, he kept firing. When he was hit again in the leg, he propped himself against the gun mount and kept firing. The Germans shouted at him to surrender. He refused. When motor launch 306 finally stopped firing, Durrant had been wounded in at least a dozen places. He was captured and taken aboard the Jaguar, where the German captain was so moved by his courage that he recommended Durrant for the Victoria Cross, an almost unprecedented act of recognition from an enemy officer. Durrant died of his wounds while in German captivity. He never knew that his bravery had been acknowledged by both sides, but the most devastating blow was yet to come. As dawn broke over Saint-Nazaire on March 28, 1942, the Germans believed they had won. Yes, the British had crashed a destroyer into their dock gates. Yes, commandos had caused some damage to harbor installations, but the dock gates themselves appeared largely intact. The attack, they concluded, had been a costly failure for the British. German officers swarmed over the wreck of HMS Campbeltown, examining her with curiosity. Some posed for photographs, others searched for intelligence materials or souvenirs. By mid-morning, there were over 300 Germans on or around the ship. At 10:35 a.m., the delayed action fuses reached their targets. 4¼ tons of high explosives detonated in a single cataclysmic blast. The sound was heard 20 miles away. The explosion vaporized everyone on the ship and killed over 250 Germans who had been standing nearby. The dock gates were obliterated. Massive sections of the caisson were hurled hundreds of feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, the Normandy dock was destroyed beyond any hope of repair. It would remain unusable for the rest of the war. The Germans, stunned and enraged by the delayed explosion, reacted with confusion and paranoia. Rumors spread that other ships were also rigged to explode. When French dock workers began their shift later that morning, nervous German soldiers opened fire, killing dozens of innocent civilians. 2 days later, delayed torpedoes from British MTB-74, which had been scuttled after developing engine trouble during the raid, exploded on the harbor floor, adding to the chaos and destroying additional facilities. The total destruction was beyond anything the planners had hoped for. Saint-Nazaire's ability to service large warships had been eliminated. Tirpitz would never be able to operate safely in the Atlantic. The strategic objective of Operation Chariot had been achieved, but the cost had been staggering. Of the 611 men who sailed from Falmouth, 169 were killed and 215 were captured. Only 227 returned to England. The casualty rate exceeded 60%, one of the highest of any British military operation in the entire war. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the highest honor in the British military system. Along with Beatty, Newman, and Durrant, the medal went to able seaman William Savage, who kept firing his gun even after being mortally wounded, and to Sergeant Thomas Durrant for his impossible stand against the German destroyer. Commander Beatty, who had sailed his ship into the jaws of death and rammed it into an enemy dock while under fire from every direction, survived the raid and subsequent captivity. He learned of his Victoria Cross while in a German prisoner of war camp, delivered to him with unexpected courtesy by his captors, who recognized extraordinary courage regardless of which flag it served. The German camp commandant personally informed Beatty of the honor, standing at attention as he delivered the news. It was a moment of strange humanity amid the brutality of war, enemies acknowledging each other's valor across the divide of conflict. Beatty's fellow prisoners celebrated as best they could. They saved rations for a modest toast. They sang, "For he's a jolly good fellow," in the cold barracks. For a brief moment, the reality of captivity faded. replaced by pride in what their countrymen had achieved. But Beatty struggled with the recognition. So many of his men had died. So many had shown equal courage and would never receive any medal at all. The Victoria Cross, he felt, belonged to all of them, the living and the dead, the recognized and the forgotten. When asked later what he had felt during those 37 minutes of sailing under fire, Beatty gave an answer that revealed everything about the kind of man he was. "I felt afraid," he admitted. "Anyone who says they weren't afraid is either lying or insane. But I also felt certain that what we were doing mattered, certain that the men behind me were counting on me. Fear and certainty, they can exist together. The key is making sure certainty wins." The strategic impact of the raid was exactly what the British had hoped for. Tirpitz never attempted to enter the Atlantic. German Naval Command, deprived of their only repair facility capable of servicing the battleship, kept her confined to Norwegian fjords for the remainder of the war. She was eventually sunk by RAF bombers in November 1944, having never fired her main guns at an enemy warship. Historians estimate that the neutralization of Tirpitz as an Atlantic threat saved hundreds of Allied ships and tens of thousands of lives. The convoys to Russia continued. American troops and supplies poured into Britain. The strategic balance of the war tilted toward the Allies. All because of one night, one destroyed dock, one commander who refused to turn back. In the decades after the war, the Saint-Nazaire raid earned a nickname that spoke to its place in military history: the greatest raid of all. It wasn't just British propaganda. German military analysts studied the operation for years, trying to understand how such a small force had achieved such devastating results against such overwhelming odds. The answer, they concluded, wasn't technology or tactics. It was something simpler and more profound: the willingness of 600 men to risk everything for a mission they believed in. When the Admirals had called the plan suicide, they weren't wrong. The odds were terrible. The defenses were formidable. A rational analysis said the raid should fail. But Commander Beatty and his men understood something the Admirals didn't. Some things matter more than survival. Some missions demand sacrifice. And sometimes, the only way to achieve the impossible is to refuse to believe it's impossible at all. The men who sailed into Saint-Nazaire that night weren't superhuman. They felt fear, doubt, and loneliness just like anyone else. They wrote letters to their families, knowing they might never see them again. They held onto photographs and lucky charms. They were, in every way, ordinary men. But ordinary men can do extraordinary things when they believe in something larger than themselves. After the war ended, survivors of the raid gathered annually to commemorate what they had achieved together. The reunions continued for decades, growing smaller each year as old age claimed more and more of the veterans. Beatty attended whenever he could, though he rarely spoke about his own role. He preferred to listen to others tell their stories, to remember friends who hadn't come home. In 1947, the town of Saint-Nazaire itself honored the British raiders with a memorial plaque near the site of the destroyed dock. French citizens who had witnessed the raid, some of whom had lost family members in the confused aftermath, came forward to express their gratitude. They understood what the British had sacrificed to strike a blow against their common enemy. The Normandy dock was eventually rebuilt after the war, but the memory of March 28, 1942 remained. To this day, the port of Saint-Nazaire commemorates the raid with ceremonies and exhibitions. School children learn about the British and French who fought and died there. The story has become part of the town's identity. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Operation Chariot isn't a memorial or a museum. It's the example it set for everyone who came after. When the Admirals told Commander Beatty that ramming the dock gates was suicide, they were stating what seemed like an obvious truth. The math didn't work. The odds were impossible. Any reasonable person would have refused. But Beatty wasn't looking for reasonable. He was looking for necessary. The mission needed to be done, so he found a way to do it. He took the impossible odds and made them work through courage, determination, and an absolute refusal to give up. That's the real lesson of Saint-Nazaire. Not that war is glorious. It isn't. The screams of the wounded, the burning ships, the friends who never came home, there's nothing glorious about any of it. The lesson is that human beings are capable of more than they know. When the cause is just and the need is great, ordinary people can rise to meet challenges that would seem laughable on paper. The 600 men who sailed from Falmouth on March 26, 1942, knew they were probably sailing to their deaths. They went anyway, not because they wanted to die, but because they wanted to matter. They wanted their lives to count for something. And they did. Tirpitz, the beast that Churchill couldn't sleep for worrying about, spent the rest of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords. The Atlantic convoys flowed freely. The tide of the war turned. And when victory finally came in 1945, the men of Operation Chariot had earned their share of the credit. Commander Stephen Beatty lived until 1975, dying at the age of 67. He returned to civilian life after the war, working in various business ventures and raising a family. He rarely spoke publicly about his Victoria Cross or the night he sailed HMS Campbeltown into Saint-Nazaire, but those who knew him well said he never forgot. The faces of the men who served under him, the friends who died beside him, the impossible mission that somehow succeeded, all of it stayed with him until the end. The bravest men I ever knew, he said once when pressed to talk about the raid, were the ones who admitted they were terrified and did their duty anyway. Courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about feeling fear and choosing something else instead. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something that existed only in memory. We chose something else that night. All of us. And I've never been more proud of anything in my life. The story of HMS Campbeltown and the Saint-Nazaire raid stands as a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept the word impossible. It's a story about sacrifice, certainly, about men who gave their lives for a cause larger than themselves. But it's also a story about hope. Because if 600 men in battered old ships could sail into the most heavily defended port in Europe and achieve the impossible, then maybe the impossible isn't as impossible as it seems. Maybe the admirals and the experts and the rational voices of caution are sometimes wrong. Maybe the only thing standing between us and the impossible is the willingness to try. That's what Commander Beatty understood on that dark night in March 1942, when the searchlights found his ship and every gun in France opened fire. He understood that some things are worth dying for. And he understood that sometimes, against all odds, you don't have to die at all. You just have to refuse to give up. The men of Operation Chariot didn't give up. Not when the patrol boat nearly spotted them. Not when the searchlights pinned them down. Not when the shells and bullets tore through their ships. Not when escape became impossible and survival meant surrender. They fought until they couldn't fight anymore, and in doing so, they changed the war. History remembers them now, as it should. But perhaps the best way to honor their memory isn't through plaques and ceremonies, it's through action, through refusing to accept that impossible means permanent, through finding the courage to try, even when the odds say failure is certain. Because that's what Commander Beatty did on the bridge of HMS Campbeltown. And that's what every person is capable of when the moment demands it. The Admirals told him ramming was suicide. They weren't entirely wrong. But what Stephen Beatty did that night changed the war forever. And the example he set, the example all those brave men set, continues to inspire anyone who hears their story. Ordinary men, extraordinary courage, an impossible mission accomplished. That is the legacy of the greatest raid of all. And that legacy belongs to all of us now. To remember, to honor, and to carry forward whenever we face our own impossible moments and have to choose between fear and something else. Choose something else. That's what they did. That's what we can do too. The night of March 28th, 1942, ended with fire and death, an impossible victory. But the morning that followed, and every morning since, has been touched by what happened there, in the convoys that sailed safely across the Atlantic, in the soldiers who landed at Normandy, in the world that emerged from the ashes of war. 600 men made a difference that night. 600 ordinary men who refused to believe in impossible. Their story will never be forgotten. And as long as it's told, neither will the truth they proved with their lives. That courage can triumph over impossible odds. That sacrifice can change the course of history. And that sometimes the only thing standing between what is and what could be is one person willing to say yes when everyone else says no. Commander Stephen Beatty said yes. His men said yes. And the world changed because of it. That's the power of courage. That's the legacy of Saint-Nazaire. And that's a story worth remembering, today and every day, until the end of time.